I think the abuse that I was already experiencing at home put me in a position where, when I was ritually abused at the camp, I'd already been conditioned to accept that type of abuse, to believe that that was what men did to young boys, to believe that there was nothing I could do about it because it was the way the world was. Because I knew in my family home that I couldn't speak out about what my father and my mother were doing, it made me aware that there was really no one that I could turn to for support. I think it was obvious to me even as a child that if I told my parents about what had happened at the camp, it would have raised too many questions about what was happening at home. I already knew the rules of the society in which I lived were adults abuse children, adults sexually abuse children, and the children must keep quiet. So when I was then taken to a camp where I was sexually abused, it seemed to just be a much more violent extension of what I had already been exposed to. I'd already been primed, in a sense, to accept that type of abuse, to accept it as normal. So the context in which I was sent to the camp was one in which I'd already been abandoned as a kid. I had no emotional connection to those around me. I was incredibly vulnerable to any display of affection or kindness from an adult, which would often turn into sexual abuse. I was abused in a social context in which it was normal to abuse children.
You were taken to a location in the north of England. What happened there?
I was taken to a camp run by an organisation called Outward Bound, and it was extremely isolated by a lake. The two most abusive teachers in that group that I remember, the history teacher, he was called Mr. Newman, an English teacher, he was called Mr. Sewell, and they both worked at King's House School in Richmond in London, where I was sexually abused many times by many different teachers. We were driven to the camp in 2 different minibuses. I remember when I arrived there feeling very isolated. On the way to the camp, we'd stopped at Alton Towers, which is a theme park. I remember the English teacher who had previously sexually abused me at the school. I think I had this growing awareness that those who were taking us to the camp seemed to be grooming different children in the group. So I think I already had this sense as we were travelling there that there was a lot of fear in me. There was a lot of fear in me that I disguised. So many activities that I was taken on by abusers, there was this presentation of it being an adventure, of it being something fun. So whilst I wanted to go to the theme park and I liked the idea of going on an adventure holiday because I'd seen the brochures that they handed out at school, I think I was hoping, despite all the odds, despite the fact this seemed to permeate every aspect of society, I think I was hoping that perhaps this was an adventure holiday, perhaps this was something enjoyable that I could participate in with adults, perhaps it was an experience that I could be involved in without being abused. When we got to the camp, I remember it being very isolated. There was a lake and a boathouse. There was a small recreation room with a video game inside. It was one of the old video games that was kind of under a glass sheet. I remember it took 20 pence pieces. And I remember that between being abused, a lot of us would hang out in that recreation room and put 20 pence pieces into the Space Invaders machine. So it felt like a way of distracting ourselves from what was happening. I remember being very worried, as I think the other kids were, that we would run out of 20 pence pieces. It felt like this video game machine was the way in which we escaped from the camp. It was the only space in the camp where I felt like I wasn't in the camp. For a few minutes we could sit in front of this video game machine, this Space Invaders machine, and not be there. Yeah, I guess I never really acknowledged how much that game helped. I'm very glad that someone made that game and put it there. And later on I went to design video games, so I feel like maybe some other kid played one of the games that we made and was able not to be where he was or she was too. Yeah. Then at night men would visit the camp. Cars would pull up in the driveway and men would come out of them. They'd take us into different rooms and they would abuse us. I could hear kids being abused in other rooms. I have my own experiences of being abused there. It seemed to typically happen quite early in the morning, around 2 or 3 in the morning. Dreading that moment in the night when I'd be woken up and taken out of my bed. I remember being burned by them after being abused, often with cigarettes. I remember the violence of the rapes that I was subjected to. I remember they were dressed in different costumes. Some of them were dressed as police officers. Some of them wore masks. It was filmed. I feel very, very angry at those men. I feel very angry at the school. I feel very sad at what happened to me. And I feel very strong. I feel like they relied on me never being this strong. They relied on the children they abused never being strong enough to speak out. And they did that through a series of practices which are well defined as ritual abuse techniques. One of these techniques was to tie a child's leg to the ceiling and to spin the child from the ceiling until the child was so disorientated that they would submit to anything, that they would split themselves, that they would do anything to avoid remembering or feeling the pain of what that experience was like. After I was spun, I was also taken to the lake where the men would nearly drown me. They would push me under the water until I was nearly drowned, and then they would drag me up from the water, and they'd keep doing it, and they'd keep doing it, and they'd keep doing it. And they seemed to know when it was that they'd conditioned us deeply enough that we would never speak out, because then we would start wetting the bed. As soon as you've traumatized a child enough that you can regress them to an earlier stage of development, then you know that you've done significant damage to their nervous system, and you know that it's very unlikely that they will ever speak out about what you've done to them because you've stored it in a pre-verbal form. It's very, very hard for them to ever speak out about what they did. And those men use that, the fact that we started wetting the beds, as an indication that they'd damaged us enough that they knew that it was safe to let us go. And they kept other children at the camp, and there was a girl called Claire, and we became friends. I now know that they were doing this in order to create a bond between me and Claire, which they would later abuse. One of the evenings I was taken into a shed on the grounds of the camp, and Claire was there, and she was tied in a chair. One of the men who was stood around her had a fork in his hand. He told me to stab Claire with the fork, and I refused, and I started shouting, and then he grabbed my hand with the fork in it, and he pushed it into Claire's face, and he did that again and again. After that, the men stood around me, and they shouted at me, "Look at what you've done, look at what you've done, look at what you've done." And they kept shouting it until I believed that I had done that, but I had not done that, they had done that. And I don't know how many children they had done that to, but they did that to me. I don't want them to do it to any more children.
If you feel comfortable with this, maybe you could talk about the rituals that you remember being forced to participate in.
What was done to me and to other children is that we were taken out into a space outside the camp. There were graves dug in the ground. We were put into the graves, and then the graves were sealed, and then I was left there overnight. So I was essentially buried alive overnight. I feel this is like a big basis for my fear of death. I see no reason to fear death. It would just be transition to another space. I think what I had always feared was being put back in those pits by those men. I think as a kid I thought this is death, being stuck in a pit. Time seemed to stop. I wasn't aware of how long I'd been left there. I didn't know if I'd be taken out of the pit. I'm also aware again that listeners are probably thinking this sounds wild and implausible. If you feel that, then it worked. Then it worked. Then exactly what those men wanted you to believe, which is that this didn't happen to me, that they couldn't do this to children. It worked. Just like they wanted to hide the Holocaust, but didn't manage it. It seems like they have almost managed to hide this. So there's a few voices like my voice and your voice who speak out, and other voices who are joining us around the world. It's a very strange life to live carrying this, but I'm glad that I'm speaking out. I'm just thinking about Claire more, and I really struggle with this, regardless of what anyone listening thinks about, maybe dubious of what I'm telling them or disbelieving. I think you have to consider this, and that is that several months ago I reported the murder of a small girl called Claire to the British police, and they've asked me nothing more about her. Is that normal? Is it normal to report a murder to the British police force and for them to not ask anything about it? And I have emails from the police acknowledging the receipt of my statements, and what I have from them mostly is silence. It's 2018. I reported the murder of a girl called Claire to the British police force. And for months, there has just been silence. Who are these people?
Did you try to tell anyone about what happened to you at the time?
It became quite clear to me at the time there was no one to tell. People at the camp who abused me appeared to be police officers. I was taken there by school teachers. My parents were sexually abusing me. It wasn't apparent to me who I could tell. Didn't seem to be an individual in that society in any position to listen or to help. Almost all of them seemed to participate, either through abusing children, through denying that abuse was happening, or ignoring it. When I came back from the camp, I, like many of the other children who were abused there, became very ill, and we were off school. I was off school for a very long time. I have school reports that reference the time I was away. The story that the school told was that we had got ill on account of algae in the lake when we'd gone canoeing. But the truth was that I, like many of those children, was very ill because we'd been raped by men who came to that camp who prostituted us. But that wasn't the school's story. The school's story is silence. Complete silence. I went to the school's Wikipedia page and I added information about a teacher who had been convicted of paedophilia in the school. Someone at the school removed that from the Wikipedia page. And the comment that they left on Wikipedia after it had been removed was something like, "This isn't relevant to the school. This isn't relevant to the school." The fact that there was a paedophile definitively operating at the school. I mean, in my experience, there are many paedophiles there, but there was one individual who had been convicted. This wasn't relevant to the school. Other information on the page included the facilities at the sports ground, that there was a hockey pitch. That there was a hockey pitch at the sports ground was more relevant to the school than the fact that paedophiles operated in the school. I think I want to say at this point that imagine 10 years ago someone had said to you, Bill Cosby is raping women, he's drugging and raping women. I think most people's reaction would be, no, he's so lovely on television. Okay. 10 years ago, if you'd said to someone, Jimmy Savile, he's raped over 1,000 children on BBC property, people would say, oh, no, he's lovely, he's on television. I'm telling you now, there are deep connections between an elite British school, the monarchy, and a camp run by Outward Bound. And I'm sure many people out there are thinking, oh, no, they're so lovely, they're on television. I invite everyone listening, and I invite them in love, to seriously hear what I'm saying, to seriously take account of this testimony, and to seriously investigate what it is that I went through.
So my last question is, how common do you feel this type of abuse is?
It's hard for me to say how common it is. My experiences, as anyone's individual experiences of anything, would give the impression that it's the typical experience. I was born into a certain time and place. I only have my own experience. I saw it happening to children around me in their family homes. A very close friend of mine killed himself on account of what was done to him by that school. I can see reverberations of what was done to me in society. Others who were sent to that school are now in politics or entertainment. In essence, many of the children at those elite schools, mine in particular, are now managing the country. I think that's terrifying. It's terrifying to consider how many children were conditioned in this way and are now running things. As for how generally widespread the practice is, I can only reiterate what I said earlier, and that is that now that I've reported this crime in extensive detail to the British police, they've asked almost nothing about it. To me, that suggests substantial institutional problem. In the same way that for years and years, those who worked at the BBC walked around doing their jobs, eating in the canteen, speaking to colleagues, writing scripts, whilst they knew that a man called Jimmy Savile was raping children in the building, whilst they knew that, they just carried on. I can imagine in the police station that's dealing with my case, with my report of the ritual abuse I experienced and the murder of Claire, I can imagine many of those policemen filling in paperwork, chatting with colleagues, doing nothing. Doing nothing. Silence. Just silence.
And this relates quite a lot to the last question, but why don't we hear more about this in the news?
I mean, this is a great question. I think the problem, I already anticipate the problem here, and that is that a lot of listeners will not want to hear the answer to that question. But I think maybe the answer to the question is probably obvious at this point. And that is, who owns the newspapers? Where does the money come from? In what ways are these people connected to those with money and power? In which ways, for example, was the BBC connected to money and power? In which ways have the BBC hidden and concealed the abuse of children in the past? Have they done that on a tiny scale? Have they just hidden 1 or 2 rapes here and there? No. They've consistently hidden over 1,000 incidents of sexual abuse on BBC property. Never mind what happened outside BBC property. And there's been no real reflection on what was done. There's been no real investigation into how that happened. Mark Thompson, who was working at the BBC during the time at which it was revealed that Savile had been raping all these children, he now works at the New York Times. The man who oversaw the BBC as they were reflecting and attempting to understand what happened with Savile, he now works at the New York Times. Now, I think there's a problem here because I think a lot of people might think, oh man, this is some sort of weird anti-media rant. I'm not anti-media. What I'm against is those who have demonstrated themselves to be untrustworthy, those who have demonstrated themselves to participate in various ways in the abuse of children, should not hold positions in newspapers, no matter the name of those newspapers or political leanings. I have no objection to whatever a particular newspaper believes collectively. I have no objection to any particular title. Just have a big problem when those who control the media, those who define the parameters in which news is spoken, those who define the topics of the day, those who edit, in essence, the stories that we receive, have a big problem when those people have demonstrated themselves to actively have participated in the abuse of children through negligence or through cover-ups. I think the tricky thing is that they've militarized us against awareness. They even invented this name, conspiracy theory. So anytime you say anything that questions the official narrative defined by these individuals in the media, you're a conspiracy theorist. I mean, what does that actually mean? It just means that you considered information other than that was presented to you. Imagine 10 years ago, oh, I've got this feeling, that Jimmy Savile's raping loads of kids in the BBC. Oh, that's your conspiracy theorist, you mad conspiracy theorist. I've got this feeling, Rolf Harris, he seems a bit weird. Do you think I think I saw him raping a child. No, you're just a conspiracy theorist. Bill Cosby, my friend said that he's been raping women. He's been drugging them and raping them. Oh, you're a mad conspiracy theorist. I've got this feeling the BBC might be institutionally covering up the abuse of children by different presenters. No, that's a conspiracy. What does that mean? It just means you looked at the information available and reached a different conclusion from that which you were presented to by the powerful, rich organisations who dictated it to you. It's not wild, it's not mad, it's very, very sensible, it's very awake. It's very awake to question these things. It's very awake to say, no, I'm not just going to accept what you told me. I do feel like power and authority can't just say, you believe what I tell you or I'll hurt you. They don't do that anymore. They say, you're a conspiracy theorist. What shocks me is that the idea that an individual or a group of individuals would consider for themselves the facts and reach their own conclusion has become unacceptable. It's become unacceptable to reach your own conclusion based on the facts. When I think about what they did to Claire, and I think about how many years I felt terrified and ashamed of what they made me do, I think what she would have wanted me to do and what I'm doing is telling everyone I can about what they did to her and likely to many other children like her. And so, although there's a lot of anger in me about what happened, there's a lot of love, because I know the way out of this isn't to attack those who abused us, but to expose what they did. I have no interest in attacking the school who sent me to the camp. I just want them to stop.
Do you feel like schools are inherently abusive because of the power dynamic between student and teacher? So essentially the architecture, and I mean the social architecture of a school, invites the exploitation of children because in a classroom, for example, you have a bunch of students who are overlooked by a teacher who sits at the front of the class, issues instructions. And I've heard some people argue that school, although it looks like an educational system, is not an educational system. The content is educational, but the system itself is designed to condition children into compliance, condition them into following orders and respecting an authority.
The whole system itself is very difficult because you're praised and supported if you follow orders and follow what the teacher is saying, which is not a good skill for being alive in the world. It's a good skill for keeping powerful people in power, and it's not a good skill for changing anything. In an optimal school, they would be encouraging children to question and to think and not necessarily follow what the teacher is saying. The dynamic there of one teacher and so many students, and I just remember the exams that we had to take, it was just so obvious to me that there was no point in me expressing anything that I really thought. I just realised at that point the best way to get through those exams was to just say exactly what the teacher thought, which is what I did, and then that's how you do very well on those exams, if you basically just follow what someone tells you to think. It's not a useful skill at all.
Yeah, I feel like school is quite a strange phenomenon because I feel like implicit in the structure of a school is this idea that we, the adults, know what's going on here and we're going to tell you what's going on so that you know what's going on too. Except, what have the adults done? At the point at which I arrived at school, what had the adults done? Okay, the adults blasted a hole in the ozone layer. The adults had created a social context in which we now know the government, many members of the government, were sexually abusing children en masse. We know the BBC was sexually abusing children en masse. There were invasions of foreign countries on the pretext of nothing more than resource acquisition. Only a few decades before, there'd been a global war in which almost everyone on the planet decided to fight each other. And yet, when I arrived in the school building, I was given the impression that we know what's going on and we're going to tell you children what's going on. I think it would be good to give children space and time to find their own interests, and then to provide them with research material and access to those people who are doing those things, engineers, mathematicians, scientists, things like this, allow them to be exposed to the true nature of things, the physicality of the world. What do you feel about that quite dramatic and forthright rant?
I mean, I think there are nuances to it. I don't think you can say that all teachers are like that. That's true of adults. On the whole, that is what adults have done to the world. But that's not to say that you can just blame all teachers. I think it's shared responsibility among all professions.
Yeah, I don't particularly blame teachers. I think it's more of a problem with adults in general, and this whole idea that adults are going to teach a child anything. I think children have so much to teach adults.
But I'm just seeing how we do have a different opinion, because I have had positive teachers, and that makes a massive difference. The fact that I actually had teachers that cared. That's why I have a slightly different viewpoint. But I also do see that these things are all interlinked, and I definitely would much prefer a free school system. And I definitely feel like children have so much to teach adults.
Yeah, I would like to set up some schools where adults have to go in and then children tell them how they feel and what they feel is going on. Because I think so many adults have become so locked into a fixed pattern of behaviour, so obsessed with money and power and these things, they've really completely lost the plot. I mean, obviously my view is rather more radical than the average person, but my view would be abolish the school system entirely and use the buildings as adult education centres where adults can come in and children can explain to them the situation that they face and the problems that they experience in this world. Because I think by the time most people have become an adult, they've become completely numbed to the reality that they live in. Everything that was difficult and abusive for them when they were children has become such a part of their everyday life, they don't recognise that it exists anymore, and they're trapped in a kind of weird fishbowl. I can talk a bit more about a very strange experience I had at school, which demonstrates the I think, general stupidity of the school system, and that is that it generally teaches what's already happened, and it doesn't teach it very well. For example, at school, at the time I was at school, computers had only just begun to take off. People had only begun to get interested in them in a big way. They were quite new to the school system, and no one really knew what computing would become in the future. And I remember I was very interested in computers, and I spent a lot of time around computers. And this was at a point at which it wasn't obvious that computers would be the future of our world. In a sense, they would be at the very heart of every profession that we know. And I remember, for example, maybe I'll put this report on the website as well so people can read it. I remember I had this school report from, funnily enough, a religious instruction teacher who said something like, this child spends much too much time around computers and he should spend more time, I don't know, I guess it was something like reading the Bible or, something else, something useful. The implication was that somehow my interest in computers wasn't productive, that it was a distraction from schoolwork. And yet it was the very thing that would be the future of humanity. So I feel like my instinct was correct, and so many children's instinct must be correct. And yet they're told by these people who are essentially living in the past, who are dragging these ancient books out of the past and demanding that we apply them to the present, that these things aren't relevant. It also didn't help me that the computer teacher, who was called Mr. Anderson, was also sexually abusing me and other children. That was a massive fucking spanner in the works as well. But it also felt like, on top of that so many people felt like I was distracting myself with computers because they were just a toy. And that's the inherent madness of the school system. I can imagine today if a child gets interested in, I don't know what's coming up because I'm not sort of plugged into it as much as I was as a kid, but to say to a kid, oh, this field is distracting or this field won't have any value, that's absurd.
Well, they do that all the time with the arts as well. I remember that I was completely put off art at school. I had a terrible art teacher. That was my worst subject when I was 14 to 16. I struggled so much with it because for me, art was really important to me. In art, I was communicating a lot about the abuse. I would draw things like a Russian doll that was crying. I remember drawing two girls who were divided, the divided self, and how much pain and suffering I was going through. At one point, I spent 5 hours on a drawing that was important to me, and then I remember she gave me some critique saying, well, you should have done this another way, and then bursting into tears because it just felt like it was so important to me. But at the same time, I felt so frustrated with the subject because I wasn't able to express myself the way that I wanted. It was this weird point where, because I was still being abused so much and was not able to be aware of what was happening, I wasn't able to express myself in that way. And the teacher did not recognize or support me in that in any way, and in fact she completely hindered. Suddenly after this teacher, I stopped drawing for like 7 years.
How old were you at the time that this art teacher critiqued your work?
Between the ages of 14 and 16.
Okay. It's kind of amazing, isn't it, the extent to which some of these teachers put down students or deter them from their paths. Music critics, and they don't really play anything or do anything. They just sit in rooms and type reviews, often quite acidic, acrid reviews of people's work, of their music. Kind of think there's a fair number of teachers who do that. I don't think it's fair to say all teachers. I did actually have one good teacher, a design teacher. But yeah, so many teachers were basically critics. I feel like so much of the education system is filled with theatre and music and art critics who basically just criticise everything a kid does, so that when they emerge from the other end of the system, they've got such an internal monologue of detrimental, angry, suppressive voices telling them this isn't good enough or this isn't quite right, that it's very hard for them to break free from all those negative messages. Yeah. At my primary school, I think I was about 8 years old, and I was in a recorder lesson, and I was told to leave the recorder lesson and not to come back because I didn't have any musical talent. And that had quite a big effect on me. Obviously now I'm a musician. I play a number of different instruments and have done professionally. And it's strange to think how many children's futures have been destroyed by one of these theatre critics in a school.
Yeah, a bit strange to just base everything on this one test. It's a lot of that, like putting people into categories of how well they can do all the time.
Yeah, I had another report, which I'll put up on the website in the show notes, from an English teacher. I was 11 years old at the time, and the English teacher in his report says that as a result of my approach to the subject, I'm playing a dangerous game. I was just thinking, I was 11 years old. I was playing a dangerous game. I don't think so. I think I was probably just exploring the world of language. I don't think... It really confuses me, the extent to which these teachers reacted to the work of their students as if they were art critics for the New York Times or something. I mean, I have problems with the art critics from the New York Times, but to sit in a school and start critiquing children as if they're Andy Warhol or Van Gogh or something, it's like, what are you doing? Why have you got to subject these children to such harsh criticism at a stage at which they should be exploring? If there's one stage in life at which they shouldn't be assessed, at which they shouldn't be critiqued, in which they should be given freedom to explore, it's then. Except what have we done? What has society done? It's decided this is the time at which we will critique you the most. This is the time at which we will assess you the most. We will examine you the most.
Yeah.
We will determine through a series of weird mechanical processes.
I remember one teacher that I had for maths in particular, we used to have to read out our grades. And I remember once I got 8 out of 20 in some tests. And I remember the teacher just looking at me and asking me why, such a horrible way. And it was terrifying. I felt like I'd done something so wrong, you know, and there's so much blame put on you. We had one science teacher. She would say the answers to all the questions and then we would just copy it for our exam. She was just more interested, I guess, in that. Yeah, keeping this appearance of doing well than like teaching us anything.
In exams at school, when the exam results came out, they'd put them on a big list on the wall and all the children would gather around and you'd see what place you were in the class. If you were the lowest 25th percent or so of the group, you would have this sense, which I often did, of impending tragedy, violence in fact. When I scored badly at school, at home I would be beaten. Or I would have things taken away or I'd be excluded. There was a threat looming over me constantly in terms of performing. And it's such a strange thing to be asking a young human being to do, to constantly perform to meet some abstract measurement devised by, in my experience, people who were paedophiles. Essentially, at my school, a group of paedophiles were designing tests for children, then ranking them according to how good they thought those children were based on those standardized tests. I mean, what a strange and corrupt and malicious system. Doesn't make any sense whatsoever. And not only, I mean, aside from the fact they were paedophiles, aside from the fact that standardized testing is a perverse and mad and completely largely irrelevant system, but not only that, but the things they were testing for had absolutely no relevance to the reality in which I would live later. I mean, for example, there was absolutely no exams for computing. I'm not saying there should be, but what a strange system to determine based on a certain number of abstract points designated by a system designed by essentially madmen, to then have a projected idea of the success of that child, and yet to exclude the most fundamental subject that our reality or our future would consist of, which is the microcomputer, which permeates every aspect of our existence, didn't exist on those tests. And yet at the time, we were told that those tests indicated our future success. What do you feel about tests? I'm quite angry today.
Well, I remember being so scared of failure and what my teachers would say of me that I used to refuse to go to the parent-teacher evening because I was so scared that they would say something bad about me. Or I remember being so terrified of failing that I didn't get the result I wanted, or I used to cry and I used to be so upset and I felt like the world had ended.
Oh, you felt like as a kid that there was some deep significance to the test results and the reports your teachers were giving you?
I just felt like if I did badly, that meant that I was a failure. It's something that I still struggle with. If something goes badly for me, I automatically blame myself. I'm bad, that I've done something wrong, or I'm not good enough.
I think that's a big problem with schools, that they give children often this constant sense of not being good enough. If you're at the lower range of the testing scale, you feel like you're not good enough. If you're at the higher range, you feel like you're on this perilous precipice on some mountain that you might fall off at any point and then all your self-worth will disappear. I think it's very strange to rank people by these numbers or some sort of numbering system. It doesn't make sense. We're all so different and unique in so many different ways, and a certain skill set which might be very valued in this moment in time might be completely useless in a few years. I mean, for example, Bill Gates, who I think many of us might agree was a genius in some way, or Steve Jobs, I feel like had they been born 60 years before, most of their skill set in terms of their expertise in microcomputing and the application of technology may well have been completely useless. It may well have been completely useless. There's so many people working in so many fields today that 60 or 100 years ago, that field simply didn't exist. Their area of expertise would not have existed.
There's such this importance about measuring everything and grading things, and it's very strange because that just permeates your thinking throughout life then. And it's strange because actually the most important things, the most valuable things cannot be measured, cannot be put in that value system, cannot be given a number or a grade. And it's weird how we just encourage those things that we can measure and see when they're not even the most valuable or important things to us, really.
At school, I used to be part of this chamber choir at King's House School, and it was a very famous and may still exist chamber choir that used to be toured around London, and we used to sing in the Royal Festival Hall. We used to sing in different hotels in London. We used to be hired by movie companies to sing on different films. One of the boys that I sung with in the choir, he was on the soundtrack to Steven Spielberg films. We sung for different pop stars. When the choir was toured around, boys were taken by people in different hotels and sexually abused. This seemed to be a way in which the school did two things. One thing that it did is it increased its perceived prestige, so it allowed itself to be seen in these rich and elite public spaces and to get credit for that. I never saw any money from that, so the school used to send choir boys out and they used to exploit them. They used to exploit our work effectively as child labour. They also supplied choir boys to Cliff Richard for his music videos and for his pop songs. In one song that was a Christmas song, interestingly enough, seasonal, and the lyrics to the Cliff Richard song were Christmas time, mistletoe and wine, children singing Christian rhyme. And many of the children from the choir I was in were sent to perform this both on the record and on Top of the Pops. So members of the King's House Chamber Choir were sent to Cliff Richard.